Kamikaze. Regardless of whether you speak Japanese or not, you know what this word means. It's the name given to the series of aerial suicide attacks that rained down on Allied forces in the final months of the Second World War. But don't we know all this already? There are a number of misconceptions abounding kamikaze attacks and around other suicide attacks during the conflict. In this video, we're going to be looking at this more closely and asking the key question: just how effective were suicide attacks in World War II truly? While you're here with us, we'd like to invite you to explore our Ko-fi page. If you don't know what Ko-fi is, it's essentially Patreon without all the censorship and political baggage. Your support on Ko-fi directly fuels our ability to produce unique and exciting content that might otherwise remain hidden in the depths of the YouTube algorithm. In fact, some of our existing videos, like the ones on the Chaco War, the Beagle conflict, and Morris Cohen's incredible journey, haven't received the recognition we believe they truly deserve. But we're determined not to shy away from such important topics, even if they might not align with the algorithm's preferences for promotion. With your support on Ko-fi, we can give videos like these a second chance, ensuring that these valuable stories and insights reach a wider audience without any concerns about our profitability month by month. We also haven't forgotten to include some awesome weekly and monthly perks for our supporters, so make sure you check out the link below. Come back with your shield, the saying goes, or on it. Plutarch recorded this utterance in his writing, later collected in the Moralis, attributing it to Spartan mothers sending their sons into battle. There are plenty of practical interpretations of what this meant. In the phalanx formation, the hoplon shield not only protected the soldier carrying it, but also the man to his left, so retaining your shield meant maintaining the integrity of the whole unit. Indeed, Plutarch himself quoted the Spartan king Demaratos, who stated that the shield is for the common good of all. But there's a deeper meaning here too. The implication that there are worse fates than death, and there are things more important than personal safety. While the Spartan martial doctrine was not really one of suicide, there was certainly a glory in death on the battlefield, and a shame in returning having cast away your shield in the face of the enemy. This idea is echoed throughout history. Centuries later, Icelandic poet Snorri Sturluson described how only warriors who died in battle could ascend to Valhalla. Other sources suggest that this was only one of the ways to reach Valhalla, but the message is the same. It's good to be hacked to bits on the battlefield, and only cowards want to die peacefully in their beds. A higher calling, a more noble truth. This is what underpins the development of suicide attacks. From Viking warriors to Al-Qaeda bombers, religion has often played a part. If you believe in a holy reward for your actions, it's a lot easier to lay down your life. Preservation of national character is also important. The Spartans were renowned for their toughness and bravery, and their fighting reflected this. Japanese soldiers in World War II were expected to put honor and country above their own lives, and relatively few allowed themselves to be taken prisoner as a result. Ideology is another key factor. From human wave attacks by the communist Chinese troops in the Korean War, to Soviet pilots intentionally colliding with their adversaries during the Second World War, soldiers have shown themselves willing to accept a high likelihood of death when driven by a strong sense of social good. Methods and means have changed throughout the centuries, but there's a core thread that runs through all of these instances. A suicide attack is not simply a suicide, a way of ending life. It's supposed to serve some sort of purpose. It's supposed to bring victory even after the individual soldiers themselves have departed this world. Beginning in October 1944 and continuing for the remainder of the war, Japanese kamikaze, or divine wind, attacks are the most famous suicide operations in the history of the Second World War and potentially of all time. The aircraft of the kamikaze was straightforward. The pilot needed only to be able to take off, fly the plane to his target, and fly directly at his target, then release the explosive ordnance just before impact. As the planes were deployed late in the war, resources were at a premium, as so aircraft like the Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi, or Sabre, were designed using wood with small amounts of steel and rubber. The The craft was compatible with a variety of different engines, so the Japanese command began using up their stockpiles of obsolete units. A radio and instrument panel were on board, but the cabin was basic compared to other Japanese planes, and the landing gear was designed to be jettisoned. These planes and their pilots weren't supposed to be coming back. The image of a warplane droning out of the sky, arcing down toward an enemy ship, and exploding in a final blaze of glory is an evocative one, but it also leans heavily on a common mythology of the Second World War. The mythology of the Japanese soldier as an apathetic automation focused only on killing and defending the emperor. Of course, this is not true. Kamikaze pilots were human beings with thoughts, fears, and apprehensions. Being selected as a kamikaze was an honor, but it was a complicated one. I could no longer avoid this fate, Keiichi Kuwahara, aged 91, told the BBC in 2017. I was flying, thinking today would be my last day alive. That's when I heard the engine making some strange noise, generating black smoke. This is what I had hoped for. I was happy I could return alive, but I was also scared of what people would think of me. Those who died for the country were heroes, Kuwahara continued, but looking back now, they could have had a fulfilling life like I did after the war. What they were asked to do shouldn't have been allowed. Kuwahara was not the only kamikaze pilot to live to tell the tale and to discuss his own emotional and psychological state on being selected for such a mission. I felt the blood drain from my face, Takehiko Ena, aged 92, said in an interview with the Guardian newspaper in 2015. The other pilots and I congratulated each other when the order came through that we were going to attack. It sounds strange now, as there was nothing to celebrate. On the surface, we were doing it for our country. We made ourselves believe we had chosen to make this sacrifice. I just wanted to protect the father and mother I loved, and we were all scared. Ena made 3 attempts at kamikaze raids, and engine trouble kept him alive all 3 times. The final attempt saw him stranded on Kuroshima Island for 3 months before he was rescued, by which time the war was almost over. But the majority of kamikazes never came home. Around 4,000 kamikaze pilots died in World War II, most aged between 17 and 24. One of the big misconceptions of World War II is that only the Japanese kamikaze carried out suicide attacks. This plays into the commonly held beliefs about the Japanese forces during the Second World War, and it neglects something very important. No matter how much of a psychological and military advantage you might achieve from a suicide attack, it's generally going to be a last resort. Basically, you don't do it unless you're desperate. In April of 1945, few nations were more desperate than Nazi Germany. The final attempt at a breakout on the Ardennes had failed, and the Allies were now putting the screws to Germany from all directions. It was nearly over. All was lost. But the fighting continued. On April 7th, 1945, around 1,300 US Air Force B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators set off with a grimly familiar objective: to pound the factories and rail switches that kept a fading Germany on life support. Just after midday, the expected happened. German fighters appeared, ready to do what they could to defend their homeland. The US gunners manned their arms and prepared for another fight in the sky. This time though, it was different. The Luftwaffe planes did not assume their usual fighting positions. Instead, they came directly at the American aircraft. And they came, and they kept coming. By the time the Americans realized what was going on, it was too late. Maneuvering the lumbering bombers out of the way was impossible, and the sickening noise of planes slamming into planes filled the sky. In the end, up to 15 of the bombers were destroyed by the Luftwaffe suicide attack. Barely a dent in the overall fighting force that afternoon, but the surviving bomber crews were horrified by what they had witnessed. So what had they witnessed? Exactly what had transpired was an attack by the Sonderkommando Elbe, a German squadron trained to ram enemy planes out of the sky. With the Allies closing in, the Luftwaffe was resorting to increasingly desperate measures to repel the invaders. Sonderkommando was not the only unit of this type among the Luftwaffe ranks. 10 days later, German planes under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Heiner Lange began smashing into bridges held by the Soviet Union on the Oder River. For 3 days, from April 17th to April 20th, 1945, the so-called Leonidas Squadron, named for the indomitable Spartan king and for his warriors at the Battle of Thermopylae, hit target after target on the Oder. Historians disagree over just how successful these missions were, but Lieutenant Colonel Lange and his men kept at it until the Red Army reached their base at Jüterbog. In fact, similar tactics were deployed by all sides at one point or another during the war. Soviet female ace Yekaterina Ivanovna Zelenko reportedly perished in a suicidal aerial ramming attack. Although there's some controversy over whether or not this attack actually occurred, the tactic was certainly deployed by the USSR's pilots. The British Royal Air Force deployed aerial ramming techniques during the Battle of Britain in 1940. While these weren't necessarily suicide attacks, the risky maneuver was generally considered a last-ditch defensive technique and often resulted in the deaths of pilots, such as Sergeant Bruce Hancock, who was killed after intentionally smashing his Avro Anson into a Heinkel HE-111 on August 18, 1940. Aerial ramming was a reported tactic for some French, Greek, Bulgarian, and American pilots, although in most cases, the pilot survived. While certainly a dangerous tactic with a high risk of death, these weren't really suicide attacks. Let's start this analysis with a few straightforward observations. Japanese kamikaze attacks began on October 25, 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest, if not the largest, naval engagements in history. Captain Motoharu Okamura, who commanded a kamikaze squadron, had this to say: "I firmly believe that the only way to swing the war in our favor is to resort to crash dive attacks with our planes. There's no other way. Provide me with 300 planes and I'll turn the tide of war." Okamura and others like him did not turn the tide of war. Leyte Gulf was lost only a day later. Kamikaze attacks continued as the Japanese grew increasingly desperate, but there were no major Japanese victories for the remainder of the conflict. Okamura himself would die by suicide, but his suicide would come via the barrel of a gun in July 1948. Sonderkommando Elbe may have taken down as many as 15 enemy planes on April 7, 1945, or the number may have been as low as 8. 28 bombers were shot down by more conventional means that afternoon. But still, the raid went ahead, German infrastructure was still pummeled, and the Nazi regime would fall for good just a month later. It's essentially the same story for Leonidas. Targets were hit, and the suicide actions undoubtedly struck terror into the hearts of the enemy, but the Soviets were still able to run supplies and men across the river, and soon threatened to overrun the squadron's position. In none of the above cases, Japanese or German, do we find a tactical advantage. But perhaps this is looking at things the wrong way. By the time the Japanese and the Germans were systematically using suicide tactics, the war was in its final throes. Nazi Germany was only a month from destruction by the time they began their suicidal strikes. Japan went about it for a little longer, but the victor of the struggle was already decided by October 1944, and all that remained was a drawn-out attritional campaign toward the Japanese home islands. The fact that these approaches were not ultimately successful is unsurprising. These were the last rolls of the dice, after all. They were not expected to be successful. Maybe we should be instead asking, could they have been successful? For the German Leonidas and Elbe units, we can be confident in saying no. It was already too late by this point, and no amount of young pilots dying in a blaze of perceived glory was going to change this. For Japan, however, it's a little more complex. By 1944, though things were going badly for the Japanese military machine, the fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, was still largely intact. The empire could still draw upon a significant number of vessels, including many of the capital ships that delivered a significant military threat. The problem was, whatever they could throw at the Americans could throw more back their way. The attempt to knock out the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in 1941 had been a failure, and the vast manufacturing resources of the United States meant their military power grew rather than shrank. Furthermore, many of Japan's most capable pilots had been killed in action in the first 2 years of the war, and with an inferior pilot training program to the Allies, the skill gap between the IJN and the USN flipped heavily in favor of the US Navy. From America's entry into the war to the final months of the conflict, the total number of US Navy battleships grew from 17 to 23. Cruiser numbers expanded from 37 to 72, destroyers from 171 to 377, and submarines from 112 to 232. The United States had 0 frigates or amphibious vehicles in 1941, but had 361 and 2,547 respectively by 1945. And then there were the carriers. The 7 fleet carriers of 1941 expanded to 28 by 1945, while the US's lone escort carrier in 1941 had been joined by an astonishing 70 more 4 years later. The United States had a floating megaforce capable of launching aerial strikes and landing enormous numbers of ground troops, as well as fighting at sea. They were basically the whole package. The IJN was up against it. Desperate situations, it could be argued, call for desperate measures. A single, well-executed kamikaze attack could knock out a carrier, and this did happen. Today, the escort carrier USS St. Lo sits on the seabed, perched on the edge of the Philippine Trench, after she was sunk by kamikazes on October 25, 1944. While most carriers could be repaired after a kamikaze strike, this shows us the danger these tactics represented for the American fleet, especially for smaller, less protected warships. What's more, kamikaze tactics were more sophisticated than many realize. The Japanese would target radar pickets, blinding the American defenders ahead of a strike. Later in the war, they used electronic countermeasures, such as flurries of metal strips that would confuse enemy radar, allowing more kamikazes to reach their objectives. Did Japan's suicide tactics work? No, not really. Was this a military blunder on the part of the Japanese? Also no. The attacks could have worked, and in some cases, they did achieve small tactical gains. Suicide attacks, like the famous kamikaze raids as well as other examples, are not designed to simply destroy enemy personnel and material. They're designed to have profound psychological impact too. Soldiers work so hard to keep themselves alive, when they're suddenly presented with an enemy who apparently shows no fear of death and will actively seek death in an effort to injure their enemy, a deep emotional response is to be expected. Studies have found significant levels of PTSD in sailors who survived kamikaze attacks. Up to 44% of a sample of those who survived in an attack during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945 were found to have significant, lifelong stress reactions as a result. While PTSD is common in those who fought in World War II and in any war, it does seem to be more prevalent in those who faced a kamikaze attack. Another study on sailors who served on the USS Emmons found that those who had been present during the kamikaze assault found it more difficult to adjust to civilian life after the war. But suicide attacks take a heavy toll on those who send the planes too. Such extreme operations do not exactly suggest that all is well with the war effort, and the waves of young Japanese men sent out to die in aerial explosive coffins inflicted an immense national trauma on Japan that the country took many years to recover from. Okamura wasn't the only kamikaze commander to take his own life either. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, also known as the father of the kamikaze, killed himself at the war's end, leaving a note which claimed he wished to atone for all those he sent to die. Kamikaze attacks and other suicide operations are such unnatural acts that they cannot fail but leave far-reaching psychological scars on those left behind. Be resolved that honor is heavier than the mountains, wrote Yasuo Kurihara in his book Kamikaze, and death lighter than the feather. The veracity of Kurihara's account has been called into question. This quote remains an interesting one. Its poetry, its philosophy, and its seeming disregard for personal safety and life for a higher, more amorphous concept like honor have helped to shape our view of kamikaze suicide attacks in the years since the war. But as we've already seen, this view is largely false. The quotes from surviving pilots display a complicated mix of emotions. A vague pride at serving their nation, their people, and their family, coupled with a very, very real and very, very understandable fear of violent death. So where does this leave us in terms of the morality of suicide tactics? By most common definitions of morality, these tactics are ethically suspect at best. Convincing a soldier to put their life at risk is one thing, convincing them to willfully throw that life away, backed by the lofty ethical frameworks of religion, nationalism, and martial duty, is quite another. There were thousands of kamikaze pilots during the war, and there have been countless instances of suicidal attacks throughout military history. It seems likely that some of these fighters were totally up for it, ready to give their lives for a cause that they deemed truly worthy. On the other hand, it's just as likely that most were terrified, uncertain, and regretful of their decision in those awful final moments. Another quote from Kuwahara's book goes like this: "Seek only to preserve life, your own and those of others. Life alone is sacred." This feels like it gets a little closer to the truth of what many kamikaze pilots would have felt when they were awarded the dubious honor of dying for the imperial cause. Kamikaze attacks were not mythology. They were very much a real threat. The sunken ships, dead sailors, thousands of lost Japanese pilots, and the psychological trauma for all concerned are evidence of this. But as we've discussed, they did contribute to much of the damaging mythology of Japan during World War II. A nation of killing machines, ready to die for a god emperor, not bothered by the idea of taking lives and losing their own in the process. This was how Japan was perceived by the outside world, and this was a fiction that haunted Japan for decades after the war. Today, Japan is known for its friendly population, its surging economy, and its extremely low crime rate. The idea of the kamikaze, while loosely tied to ideas of honor and tradition that are very important to this day in Japan, was a hindrance to the country's post-war rebirth and success. But not everyone thinks like this. In an interview with the BBC conducted in 2017, a young Japanese man named Shunpei described kamikaze pilots as heroic. His older brother, Takumi, was surprised. "Heroic?" he asked. "I didn't realize you were so right-wing." It might seem strange to talk about something like kamikaze in these terms, but this did become a political reality in Japan in the late 20th century. By the 1990s, right-leaning nationalist groups set out to reframe Japan's wartime story and its imperial history in more positive terms. Kamikaze was certainly part of this, as it was emblematic of the honor codes ingrained into Japan's long feudal history. Fresh battle lines were drawn on Japan's culture and history. Left-leaning Japanese people favored the view that Japan had been wrong to prosecute the war in the way it did, while right-leaning individuals saw great value in the honor and tradition of the imperial Japanese forces. Perhaps this posturing is all a little unfair to the pilots themselves. It's difficult to describe the pilots who flew those missions as anything other than heroic. While the practice of kamikaze is morally dubious, the pilots that manned the planes were willing to lay down their lives for a cause they believed in, for country, for family, and for honor. Irrational and stupid were two of the other words used by interviewees in 2017. Perhaps this sort of judgment is best reserved for the decision makers, those who sent these young men to almost certain death, rather than those idealistic young men themselves. What was Japan's aim for the kamikaze campaigns? If all had gone to plan, perhaps they thought they could knock out key US Navy carriers and hobble American designs on the Japanese home islands. While this may have been possible, they'd have had to knock out 28 fleet carriers and 71 escort carriers to achieve this. Also, missions like the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings did not launch from carriers at all, but from the North Field Base in the Marianas. The US could still strike Japan even without their carriers. Maybe the plan was to traumatize the Americans so much that they would give up the fight altogether. Possibly. Kamikaze attacks were certainly horrifying for those who witnessed them. But American troops had gone through horrific traumas right across the Pacific, losing tens of thousands of men. Would the American command be content to just give it all up and endure all that suffering for nothing? Probably not. And then there are the resources. Each kamikaze attack, successful or otherwise, meant the loss of planes and men. Even when recycling obsolete engines, there were only so many of those planes and only a finite number of men. Japan could not do this forever. While Japan's suicide squadrons were more effective than those of Nazi Germany, it was still a final, desperate roll of the dice. In the end, the human cost, the national trauma, and the unpredictable results of suicide tactics meant the operations simply were not worth it, and they remain a tragic footnote in Japan's history. But what do you think? Are suicide attacks ever worth it, from a tactical or moral standpoint? Or are they just symptoms of desperation from a losing army? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.